10% Belize and proud of it, sir. Don't tell me about maritime area. Long time ago, agreement by the slave master. Talking about the head on the Belize and dollar because patriots. All people who love them country bad, bad, love them homeland. Will never give it up to another nation. Them country bad, bad, love them homeland. Will never give it up to another nation. This is the we with a fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. Follow me now. This is the we with a fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. This is me. My name is Pupa. Belize me come from the Belize City area. 110% Belize and proud of it, sir. Don't tell me about maritime area. Long time ago, agreement by the slave master. Talking about the head on the Belize and dollar because patriots. All people who love them country bad, bad, love them homeland. Will never give it up to another nation. Them country bad, bad, love them homeland. Will never give it up to another nation. This is the we with a fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. Follow me now. This is the we with a fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. This is me. My name is Pupa. Belize me come from the Belize City area. 110% Belize and proud of it, sir. Don't tell me about maritime area. Long time ago, agreement by the slave master. Talking about the head on the Belize and dollar because patriots. All people who love them country bad, bad, love them homeland. Will never give it up to another nation. Them country bad, bad, love them homeland. Will never give it up to another nation. This is the we with a fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. Follow me now. This is the we with a fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. This is me. My name is Pupa. Belize me come from the Belize City area. 110% Belize and proud of it, sir. Don't tell me about maritime area. Long time ago, agreement by the slave master. Talking about the head on the Belize and dollar because patriots. To no Guatemala. Follow me now. This is the we with a fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. This is me. My name is Pupa. Belize me come from the Belize City area. 110.
Greetings and welcome to Sunday Review. I know there must have been about 6 weeks. Hey, first time that happened, but that's a life got some time. But I'm happy to be back. I'm YaYa Marin Coleman, producer and host of Belize's only news review talk show here on XTV and being simulcasted on Creme Radio. You may go to YouTube and put in XTV Belize or Facebook page XTV Belize because this is a conversation you do not want to miss. It's where we make sense of the news. I am intentional in seeking out credible people to have evidence-based conversations that will assist Belizeans primarily at home and in the diaspora and everybody else would listen to have a more comprehensive, evidence-based working knowledge of news stories that make the news and sometimes they make the news. So the topic, especially considering the concerns about the security of Belizeans at home currently, I assisted with hosting WB this past week for a couple of days, and one of the main topics of conversations was the security of Belizeans, and a number of Belizeans support the position. The Prime Minister has mentioned it, the Commissioner of Police has mentioned it, about following the Bukele response to violence in El Salvador. The president is Nayib Bukele. So a guy in El Salvador links, and I meet a new person, excited about her, who I'll introduce now. I don't know if I pronounced your name correct. This morning, our guest is Leslie Schuld. It's Schuld, and she is the co-founder of Center for Interchange and Solidarity in El Salvador. Good morning, Leslie.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me. This is wonderful to have this conversation and let people know the other side of the coin of what's happening in El Salvador.
Thanks. I don't know if I would call my sister name, but my sister has stays with me El Salvadoran link. Thank you, sis, for all the links that we had to set me up. Belizeans, you can look forward to these conversations, I would say, from below within communities, credible people from El Salvador or living outside of El Salvador for safety reasons, or would be first generation American Salvadoran or whatever it may be. Leslie, tell us about yourself. How did you, are you an American?
I'm an American, but I also have Salvadoran citizenship I'm proud of.
But
Since I've lived here for half my life. I'm 62 and I've lived here in El Salvador 31 years.
how is it that you relocated to El Salvador, a European woman? Tell us, how did this happen?
Well, when I was a freshman at the University of Dayton in Ohio, the war was breaking out in El Salvador. And I accidentally kind of went to see a film on El Salvador, the Civil War, and our photography teacher took us to this film one night at class, and I was horrified because the US government was financing this war and financing basically the wealthy families in a war against the poor. And so I got involved. We formed, after that film in January of 1981, we formed a committee, and I got it. Somebody saw me at the film and said, "We're having a meeting." I was this young, naive student, and I went. And then it was a few months later, and I was studying for my final exams that semester, and they were organizing a protest, and I ran into one of the coordinators of the committee, and she said, "We're having a protest because there was a massacre in El Salvador." I said, "Well, I'm studying for my final exams." And she said, "Well, it depends what your priorities are." So I guess she set me on the right track. You have these angels in your life that give you a clue. And when I graduated, I, went to study Spanish in Nicaragua, and the U.S. was financing the Contra War, again, against a war against the poor. So I got very involved in organization CISPAS in the United States to lobby our government to stop funding the war and to call for respect for human rights. And when the war was ending, I was the national program director of CISPAS, and we had to lay off a lot of people because people give more money during war than for peace and reconstruction. So our conversations with the Salvadorans was that even though the war has stopped, the root causes are still present. The deeper root cause from the Spanish conquest, when they took the land from the indigenous and made a big gap between the rich and the poor, and then the shorter root cause that led to a civil war in the 1970s and 80s was the lack of democracy and respect for human rights. So although some of those measures were addressed in the peace accords that ended the Civil War in 1992, they were just on paper. So the Salvadorans said, we still need international solidarity. So I volunteered to come down to help found the CIS. I said I'd come down for 2 years, but it's turned into 31. So that's the short version of how I got here. And I've stayed here because the people are amazing. They're very humble, and they want to work for social and economic justice. But unfortunately, we still have the same patterns of violence, discrimination against the poor and the indigenous. And now it seems like we're back to square one where we were in 1980, the lack of democracy and human rights.
What has been your family's response to your decision?
Well, of course, they didn't like it. They always want me to come back. But I think in the end, they are proud of me because they've seen what a difference our organization has been able to make. My family, I was raised Catholic as well. And in 1989, when the wealthy families and the government assassinated 6 Jesuit priests and their co-workers because they were teaching social justice, my parents said, that it was important what I was doing because they realized that, the depth of it, that it wasn't just what the narrative was that we were, it was part of the Cold War and we were fighting communism when we were actually fighting the poor.
Can you share a little bit more about, you mentioned a number of things. So about the Cold War, the US involvement, and liberation theology.
Yes, well, liberation theology, El Salvador was conquered by the Spanish, and with the Bible in one hand and the sword in the other, and so it's very historically Catholic country. That's not as true anymore, because people have been afraid, because the liberation theology kind of changed the history, and said that the poor could work for social justice here on earth. They didn't have to wait to get their reward in heaven, as it said in the Old Testament. If you were born poor, that was God's will, and you'll get your reward in heaven. But liberation theology was following the life of Jesus in the New Testament, who walked with the most vulnerable people, and said that you could work for social and economic justice here on earth. You didn't have to wait till you died. So there was a whole movement of in the Catholic Church for liberation theology, for social and economic justice. And at that time, in the 60s, 70s, Salvadorans, what I mentioned, were basically slave laborers. They worked on the coffee farms, which only brought income a couple of months out of the year. During the harvest, they made 10 cents a day. They lived the rest of the year growing corn and beans, that they had to give the best part of their crop to the wealthy landowner, the landowner that stole the land from them. So they were basically, there was a grave injustice, and this liberation theology taught that that wasn't meant to be, that that's not right, and you could work for change. So people started to organize, farm workers, students, in the 70s, based on a lot on those Catholic teachings. And that's why so many priests and nuns were killed in El Salvador, because they were teaching social justice, and including, of course, our Archbishop, who is now a saint, Romero. He, even though, he was named Archbishop because he was very conservative, but people didn't know was that he really followed the teachings of Jesus. So he began to be a voice for the poor. And in the end, it was a liability for those wealthy families, and they assassinated him. But his legacy has lived on in the Salvadoran people. And right now the government's they tried to tear down the painting of him at the airport. In another city, they're tearing down his statue, but his teachings have had an impact in the world and in El Salvador. That you can walk and defend the rights of the poor, and not fall into that they're the criminals or stigmatized. So that had a influence, and I think continues to have an influence in El Salvador, and can't be erased by just tearing down statues or paintings. So yeah, unfortunately, the U.S. financed the war. They then financed the peace accords, and were very supportive of democracy and human rights, and building an alliance to support democratic elections, human rights, a government official human rights office to investigate human rights violations by the government, dismantling the repressive military and police forces, and creating a new national civilian police based on human rights. And so the U.S. the ambassador here, Jean Maines, was very outspoken when in 2021, President Bukele dismantled the Supreme Court justices and the Attorney General illegally, and without any process to name the new ones. Just people that were loyal to him were named in that place. The U.S. was very outspoken about dismantling democracy and balance of power, and checks and balances. But then Bukele closed the doors to dialogue with the government. So right now, the U.S. government is trying to maintain their relationships with the government based on the popular vote for him. But at the same time, I think is very concerned about the human rights violations and the dismantling of democracy, which was, hard fought and won. Thousands of people gave their lives to build a democratic country, and countries from all over the world helped to finance building that democracy, and then it's being dismantled so easily, not only in El Salvador, but concerns in other countries, including the US as well, that this strain authoritarianism is taking root and popularity and support.
I read somewhere about 14 families that controls El Salvador. Is that still true? And what do you know about them if it's true?
Well, historically, with the Spanish conquest, it's said that there's 14 departments or states in El Salvador, and they were divided up among these 14 wealthy families. And those families have continued to have a lot of power in El Salvador. They, like Cristiani, Dueñas, Regalado, a lot of them are Spanish names. And they continued to have a lot of power. They first, when the first came, they made their fortune out of growing indigo, natural dyes that were exported to Europe. And when synthetic dyes came in, they switched to coffee in the early 1900s as the main export crop. But when the war broke out, coffee was no longer a great source of income. So those families that invested in banking and financial institutions and building, those families maintained their wealth. The Bukele family was not part of those 14 families. They were an immigrant family from Palestine. And they were kind of left out. And now they're building their new oligarchy. They've kicked out some of those traditional oligarchs like Cristiani. They confiscated all his properties, former President Cristiani, and not to give to the poor. Then Bukele held his brother's wedding at Cristiani's house last year. So they're building their own new oligarchy with their own people loyal to the Bukele family and a few families surrounding them. They've over $1 million from the government bank. They've gotten millions of dollars in loans to family members of the Bukele family and some of their chief deputies and loyalists. And even though the Legislative Assembly have the highest salaries in the country, which are about $6,000 a month, that's not enough to pay off their buying properties worth $1 million or $500,000. So they're obviously, that loyalty is going to be maintained because they can't pay those loans if they don't have a job in the Legislative Assembly or in government position.
Thank you, Leslie. I read somewhere and I started saying it. I don't call them the oligarchy or the elites anymore. I call them the predatory class. How do you maintain all this knowledge? There's a lot of information and facts and lived experience that you have, and you don't know what someone may ask you. How do you maintain all this knowledge to have a conversation, Leslie? What's your reasoning pattern? How does it work in your head?
Well, I think, different sources. First, I've been involved in this since 1981. So I've read a lot of the Salvadoran history, but I've also lived it. And my main base of information is the communities themselves and listening to the people, which I've been able to build trust in our organization, walking with them and not for personal or political interests. So people that are more conservative in giving out information because it's been used to repress them in the past have shared information with me, including people in the government, sensitive information, because they trust the work that we're doing. You asked me earlier, in El Salvador, obviously El Faro is the best investigative journalism that's happening. but there's you know, on a daily basis, it's interesting because La Prensa Gráfica and Diario de Hoy, which were newspapers that were not trusted because they were owned by the oligarchs, are now covering the opposition. They're giving a voice to the people that have been excluded. They're afraid, you know, there was the right as well as the left paid a high price for the war and don't want a war to come back again. And they're giving a voice to the vulnerable people that are the victims of the current regime of exception. It's not just the gang members. In fact, I would argue most of the people arrested are innocent or victims of the gangs themselves. The gangs, some have been arrested, but many were notified that this policy was coming and fled the country or are in hiding within El Salvador. But yeah, so though there's other online newspapers like Focus, and then in the US, some of the mainstream media has covered, but mostly at the beginning of the regime of exception, they haven't given continual coverage. But there have been important articles published in the New Yorker magazine and the American magazine, which is a Jesuit magazine, and different independent sources in the US have covered, but I don't think they've given the in-depth knowledge about what's happening in El Salvador is scarce. My organization, the CEASE, the Center for Exchange and Solidarity, together with another legal aid organization, Socorro Jurídico Humanitario, we recently did a human rights visit to Washington, D.C. and New York, and even people that should know what was going on were very you know, and know about the regime and there's violations, but their mouths dropped when we told them the extent of what's going on right now in El Salvador. So, you know, I think Googling, you can find some good articles, but there's no, you know, constant coverage of what's going on outside. I mean, there is coverage. I think I've had interviews with Telegraph in England, El País in Spain, newspapers in Norway, and I've spoken with journalists from the Washington Post, New York Times. The Progressive magazine has done an article. But yeah, it's not in the US, the main image or outside the country is in many countries, because yeah, I run into people in the airports and stuff from different countries. It's this image of all these gangs being lined up in this new mega prison. And people believe that, you know, the gang problem is solved. And that's what the president himself says, that the gang problem is solved. Then why do they still have the regime of exception and the suspension of constitutional and human rights? When those people in the mega prison that was built, the biggest prison in the Americas that can hold 40,000, those gang members that are tattooed, you know, from head to foot, most of them were arrested in the prior administrations of FMLN and Arena. And they, you know, those are the ones being moved to this new mega prison. And the innocent prisoners are being held in prisons that are like 300% overcrowded or 400%. Like there's 200 men in a cell and they have one toilet. The women's prison, one of the women that we got out of prison, she said there were 200 women in her cell. We asked how many toilets. She said there were 2 buckets. There wasn't even a toilet where they have to go to the bathroom. So the media has only been allowed into the new mega prison, Secot. They're not allowed into the prison where the innocent are being held because of the grave conditions there. The government's using food as a weapon, collective punishment. At first, people were only getting 1 4-ounce meal a day. Then they were getting 2. I've heard now they're getting more because of international criticism. They're given 1 glass of water a day, and, you know, extreme heat conditions for the past 3 months in El Salvador. They have no right to, it's now 2 years, over 2 years, they have no right for a private meeting with the attorney. They have no right to meet with their family, no right for correspondence with their family. These are grave human rights violations. And the few people that our organization has gotten out of prison, many have lost 60 pounds, are covered from head to foot with scabies, have kidney disease for not having enough water. We have to get them immediate medical health attention because they may die after they get out because of these conditions. When they told us when they get into prison, they were forced to walk half a city block on hot gravel on their knees. And then at the end, when they reached, they were beaten by prison guards as part of their initiation. So, horrendous conditions inside El Salvador, in El Salvador prisons, in addition to the arbitrary arrests.
Tell us some more about your organization that you co-founded and where you get your funding from.
Okay. Well, the CEAS, we were founded at the end of the Civil War. We'll be 31 years old this year. And since we were founded right as the war ended, our main focus was on election observation to promote the democratic process, human rights, because even though human rights were a big part of the peace accords in those first democratic elections in 1994, candidates for the opposition, which was the former guerrillas, the FMLN, became a political party as part of the peace accords. Several of their candidates were assassinated. So we were focused on human rights and democratic elections when we started, and we had a Spanish and English school to promote solidarity and exchanges. And our main focus is solidarity, and solidarity means building relationships of mutual respect to work for social and economic justice. It's not charity. We're not about handouts. So it's really about building awareness and working together with the Salvadorans as a community. We learn from them, they learn from us, and we build a stronger movement for social and economic justice. As the peace accords were implemented, many people were leaving the country, many leaders, because they couldn't put food on the table. So we focused our human rights then on more social and economic empowerment. We started programs for women to empower women and start small businesses. We started a scholarship program, not just to give access to high school and university to the economically left out, but also to build leadership, to give them the tools so they could stay in the country and be protagonists for to build a country that most Salvadorans want. So that was our focus, and clean water and the environment. Climate change, El Salvador is hugely impacted because it's an overpopulated country. It's the size of the state of Massachusetts, one of the small states in the United States, and there's 6 or 7 million people. And there's a coast where half the country's on the Pacific coast, and it's an earthquake zone. So it's a huge vulnerability in terms of climate change, El Salvador. So we have and the water's extremely contaminated. So we have a community-based program on clean water and the environment. And we still are doing those programs, but unfortunately we've had to go back now 30 years and refocus on human rights and democracy because since we work in poor communities, they are the main victims of the Bukele policy of the regime of exception, which is the so-called war on gangs. But we've worked with these communities for 25 or 30 years, and we know many innocent people that have been arrested. We're not, if they want to arrest the gang members, they've tortured our communities as well. But now they've substituted the police and military for the gangs. The military and officers are raping women. The police have a blank check. The head of police said they're the judges of the streets now, just based if you look at a policeman at the wrong way, you can be arrested, and they throw you in jail and throw away the key. And there are judges' orders to release innocent prisoners, and the head of prison has more authority than the judge's order. So it's upside down. So that's why we've had to go back to prioritize our human rights program that we had. We still did some human rights programs because, we worked with a community that didn't have rights to their land. In the previous administration, they also used repression, and people in our communities were victims of that repression as well, but not to the magnitude that they're being victimized right now. It was, isolated cases. Now it's the norm. So really, we're working on teaching the young people that what their rights are. We've had to hire a lawyer to try to get some of the innocent people out of jail, and making, getting out to those media and being a bridge. So some of the family victims and some of the people that have gotten out of prison can give their testimony so people know the reality. I know a lot of the countries say they want to emulate the Bukele model because there's supposedly no crime in El Salvador. But I would argue, first of all, that it's unsustainable if it's built on violating people's rights and making the poor poor. This piece is not that sustainable. It's also very mediatic. Bukele was the owner before he became mayor. He ran a publicity company, and he's very in tune with social media and young people. He knows that people were fed up with the old political parties for not carrying out some of their promises. And so he's a master at manipulation. With any government functionary goes out to do something, they have at least 10 photographers with them to say, what great things he's doing. And what I tell people, not all that glitters is gold. He's showing, Miss Universe, and we had these Central American Olympics, and the Chinese built this huge, bright library downtown. But, this week I was going to communities that were affected by these tropical storms that have been hitting the last 2 weeks, and the roads are unpassable. People's homes are flooded. Their things are ruined, filled because they live in deplorable conditions. And so there's a side of that continues in El Salvador that's not being published. And the government has there's no transparency. Everything is under these reserve laws, everything is secret, including, how much was spent on COVID, how many people are actually arrested. We have to rely just on what they say. Anything about the people that have gotten out of prison or it's all secret. And, you sent me an article about this policeman who had murdered dozens of women and children in Chalchuapa, and then that is all secret under reserve. Supposedly, this whole policy of regime came because the gangs broke their pact with the Bukele administration and killed 87 people one weekend, yet nobody knows their names. Nobody has been arrested for the crimes that allegedly were committed by these gangs. So the transparency, there's no transparency. There was the Commission for Transparency, CCS, Bukele in his campaign for president said, how he wanted transparency. But as soon as they started to denounce some of the corruption of their own administration and the handling of the pandemic, they shut it down and kicked him out. So there's two sides of the coin on this, and it's not all that glitters is gold. It's not all bright lights. There's a lot of injustices happening. There was even though Bukele won by a landslide, nobody can debate that. There was a very low voter turnout. Bukele, days before the elections, gave out huge food baskets to every family when majority of family are suffering economically. They're not even getting 3 meals a day. And so he, on behalf of the president, which is illegal, days before the elections, handed out huge food baskets to every poor family. So there's huge, manipulation of what the reality is and what the long-term impact this regime. We've had hundreds of thousands left orphaned. Most of the, as I said, a lot of the people arrested are workers that provided for the family. The mothers are having to go to work and leave their kids at home, not only to sustain the family, but they have to go to the prison every month and provide food, medicine, clothing, and hygiene, because the government's not providing that in the prisons where they don't allow the media and where the innocent are being held. Whereas in the Sekot, the new mega prison where the gangs are being held, they're getting by their own interviews, because journalists are allowed in there, they're getting 3 meals a day. They have a clinic, state-of-the-art clinic, 24/7. They have a gymnasium. They each have their own bed. Even though, they have these pictures where they're all lined up and chained together, they're actually getting much better conditions than where the innocent prisoners are being held, which are over 300% beyond capacity, 1 bathroom for 200 people, no access to medicine. They get a doctor's visit once every 3 months. If they fall sick the day after, they're not attended to. All the 300 deaths documented of people that haven't had a right to a trial or a hearing, have 96% have no gang ties, and only 1 person has died in the gang prison, and that person had just been transferred from the other prison. So all the deaths are happening where the innocent are being held. So their rights there are grave human rights abuses, and the gangs are being treated with much more respect and attention to the norms of treatment of prisoners.
Well, that's a lot, Leslie.
Sorry,
But
I spelled that all
we
out.
appreciate it. We have to take our first break. Everyone stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Skip the trip to the bank and perform cash withdrawals at your neighborhood store with Atla Express. Withdrawals are now free, and customers can withdraw up to $300 daily. All you need is your Atlantic Bank Visa debit card along with an ID. Atla Express is easy, convenient, secure, and near you. Atlantic Bank, building the future together.
Brothers Abet is celebrating Super Handy Dads for the entire month of June with super handy deals that just can't be beaten. Give that super handy dad the perfect gift from our super selection, like 15% off all power tools and hand tools store-wide, 15% off track car batteries, 20% off Eureka Vats, 20% off Decon Matte Emulsion, and 25% off Valspar and Dutch Boy paints. Plus, for every $50 you spend, get a chance to win $500 worth of tools for 3 super special dads. So give dad his best Father's Day gift yet from Brothers Abet. Come in or reach out to us today. Brothers Abet wishes all super handy dads a super happy Father's Day.
Belize and proud of it, sir. Don't tell me about maritime area. Long time ago, agreement by the slave master. Talking about the head on the Belize and dollar because patriots. All people who love them country bad, love them homeland. Will never give it up to another nation. Them country bad, love them homeland. Will never give it up to another nation. This is we we the fear. No Nobody give it to no Guatemala. Follow me now. This a GTA, we don't care. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. This a me. My name is Pupa. Belize me come from the Belize City area. 110% Belize and proud of it. No, tell me about maritime area. Long time ago, agreement by the slave master. Talking about the head on the Belize and dollar because patriots. All people who love them country bad, bad love them homeland. Will never give it up to another nation. Country bad, bad love them homeland. Will never give it up to another nation.
Welcome back to the second segment of Sunday Review. That I wanted the shortest break. I'm like, I have to stay on time. I have to stay on time. Anyways, breakdown. We have Leslie Schuld from CIS El Salvador. I know I'm not saying it right. Correct me, Leslie. It's an organization. It's the Center for Interchange and Solidarity in Salvador. San Salvador is the capital of El Salvador. And we have Leslie with us this morning to give us, Jerry, you could show the gallery. No, we'll show two away. So you could choose the gallery option. It's so important that Belizeans tune in and hear stories from below, from credible people of what's happening in El Salvador. And I asked Leslie in this segment to do us and Copa to go back and come forward so listeners and viewers and those streaming online could know that this is systemic. The injustices are systemic in El Salvador, and the people who are suffering the most, who are dying, who have to leave just to survive, well, those who can, because not everybody have somewhere to go, how these policies have impacted their lives and how instrumental the United States, their foreign policy have been in wronging people such as those in El Salvador. Go ahead, Leslie.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, the patterns of, exclusion, economic exclusion have continued. I think since the peace accords, the governments up till now were successful in building respect for human rights and having transparent elections and allowing for opposition viewpoints to get out. Those spaces are being closed right now. But I think, somebody like Bukele was able to win because people, the gang problem that started after the war, and that was these gangs, people have to understand that were exported from the United States. Many Salvadorans that fled the war didn't speak English, went to Los Angeles, and they were being beat up by other gangs. So they ended up forming their own gangs in defense and to survive. And they were, mostly the young men were sent because they were the ones being recruited by the army or the guerrillas forcibly. So they joined gangs as a means of survival. So when the war ended, the US started deporting these gang members back to El Salvador. The gangs were born in the United States, not in El Salvador. And they gained quite a bit of power because the war ended and the government really didn't know how to deal with these disintegrated families, and then these young men who were involved in criminal activity being sent back into the country. There were no programs for youth, and so they were able to take hold. And so I think that was the main thing that gave rise to President Bukele, because he was young. When he was mayor of San Salvador, he had programs working with at-risk youth. He had a massive scholarship program to integrate the people left out in. So people felt that was the promise, that there would be a new policy that would, really work on social inclusion. And when he became president, the opposite has been taken into account. Our national university, which is the largest university in El Salvador and free, so more accessible to the poor, has been only online for 4.5 years since COVID. And it's not been reopened, I think because obviously students, it's the heart of where students begin to analyze things and begin to organize and speak out. So quite the opposite. The scholarship programs he ran as mayor, they've all been done away with. He's done away with mayors that have in other cities that had scholarship programs. He promised there would be a national university in every department built. Not one has been built. He promised there would be, I can't remember, like 1,000 schools rebuilt or repaired or new schools. None of them have been, or only a handful have been renovated. Most, with these storms are badly damaged because of they're much in need of infrastructure. So yeah, that's how the gangs took hold, and then that's how somebody like Bukele, the traditional Arena and the FMLN parties did not really renovate their membership or their leadership. This in the elections, for instance, before Bukele came into power, all the FMLN deputies were former guerrilla leaders. And this is 30 years after the peace accords, not incorporating young people or analyzing the new social and economic reality worldwide or in the country. And, the FMLN was made up of different organizations, and some had opposing organizational structures. One was, very vertical, top down, and one was very grassroots. That change comes from the bottom up. Well, the vertical organization really took control of the FMLN, so people felt left out and not doing the community organizing that they did during the war when they worked to empower unions, students, farm workers. When they got into government, they became very top down internally, although when the FMLN, they weren't top down like Bukele around the whole country. They did, if there was a human rights abuse, like I mentioned, we could go to the human rights procurator's office and the government would address that. And so there were a lot of policies that the former governments that were very positive in opening up democratic spaces, opening space for civil society, respect for human rights, that are being closed down right now. But people, I think like in other countries, people became disgruntled with traditional political parties and they weren't making the changes that people wanted to see fast enough. And so that gave some rise to people then supporting this young new president who was doing a lot of innovative programs when he was mayor. But yeah, there's a lot of debts in society. You mentioned the El Mozote massacre took place in December of 1981, and the U.S. actually helped cover that up. It was a massacre of women and children, mostly by the Salvadoran military, that was financed by the U.S. When the Washington Post and New York Times came out to cover it, wrote an article, the Washington Post reporter was fired and the New York Times reporter was moved to the business section. And then it came out that, no, it was a fight between the guerrillas and the army rather than over 1,000 women and children that were massacred in cold blood. So yeah, the U.S. does not have, the U.S. definitely has, responsibility, and the U.S. could have been investing to address the root causes of the war, the social and economic exclusion and the lack of democracy and human rights. So the gangs, going back to the gangs, became so powerful. Both the Arena and the FMLN governments negotiated with them, but I would argue, even though they deny it, the Bukele, and they didn't make it a media show, there's evidence that the Bukele administration too has negotiated with the gangs, and one which I've been talking about, that the gang prison conditions are much better than what the innocent people's prison conditions are. But there's also, Alfaro has documented very well cases of the gang leaders being escorted out by government ministers. In fact, tape recordings, pictures being held in exclusive apartments here in San Salvador, and then gotten out of prison with no judicial order. They were people that had 40-year sentences, so they were given the key to let out of prison driven out of the country, given even a gun as well as funds. And they ended up being arrested in Mexico. And Mexico has an extradition treaty with El Salvador, but also knew that the El Salvadoran government was covering for them and letting them out. And so they booked the plane ticket back to El Salvador, but with a stop in Houston. So the FBI actually got them off the plane. They're in jail now in New York. So that's other evidence of some negotiation, that these gang leaders were let out by the Bukele administration, that the lower level gang members are given better conditions in prison and a new prison. Those are, and as well as pictures of, the head of prison, who's still the head of prison, ushering government officials that were with masks over them into negotiating with the gangs inside the prison. Prisoners getting kind of get out of jail free cards where they were able to go to hospitals and be able to meet with government officials. And so, yeah, there's the evidence is that there's also negotiations with this government. And then why there was actually, because as I mentioned, many of the gang leaders were rounded up by previous administrations, and the levels of killing had dropped way down before the regime of exception. And all of a sudden, one weekend in March, allegedly 87 people there were 87 homicides when there was only, a few homicides a week prior to the regime of exception. So the fact that those 87 people allegedly killed by the gangs, people, at least human rights groups and independent media, are saying that showed that there was a breakdown between the negotiations between the Bukelean government and the gangs, that they killed those people that weekend. And that led to the regime of exception, which is in the Constitution. You can suspend constitutional rights if there's a reason to, and it was suspended during the war. They were suspended during COVID for a couple months. But this is the longest period they've renewed it every 30 days. And you have to have a justification to suspend constitutional rights. And if the justification was these 87 murders, and allegedly there's been 0 murders since then, the justification no longer exists to have the state of exception, and eliminate people's right to due process, presumption of innocence, and other rights. So that's the other factor that people point to in terms of that point to negotiations between this government and the gangs as well. So that's a little bit of where we are now and what these patterns are. They're not new, but and what Bukele's doing is not new either, even though it's presented as it's innovative and ending violence. But these are the same measures that were taken in 1932 by General Maximiliano Hernandez when he massacred indigenous people who were fighting for their rights to get paid on the coffee plantations because of the economic depression worldwide in 1929. As I mentioned before, the indigenous got paid 10 cents a day for 2 months out of the year to pick coffee, and then lived off of the corn and beans they grew. When the economic depression happened, they didn't even get that 10 cents for picking the coffee. And that's when they began to organize for their rights. And General Maximiliano Hernandez, his response was repression against those indigenous people that were demanding their rights. In 1979, when the Civil War broke out, the government launched a war against the poor. It was called, and the US sponsored this policy called taking the water from the fish. Most of the casualties were civilians, arguing that they were the ones that gave food to the guerrillas, and the guerrillas couldn't exist if they didn't have the civilian population supporting them. And was used to justify massacres, including of our Saint Romero, the Jesuit priests, and 70,000 workers and farm workers and poor people. And now, the government is justifying locking up poor people by the problem of the gangs. And we're not defending the gangs. They've carried out horrendous crimes against very valuable Salvadorans. But it's the policy is using repression against the poor neighborhoods where the gangs live, not principally against the gang members, but the people that live around them. And I think using the same philosophy that if the gangs communities have no income, that the gangs can't continue. But it's really a discriminatory war against the poor again. And so these policies are not new. They were popular in the 1930s, they were popular in the 1970s and 80s, and they're popular now, but that doesn't make them right. Hitler was very popular when he came into power until he wasn't popular anymore. But it's people are afraid to speak. There's self-censorship and getting out what the injustices that are happening in this apparent peace that's happening right now.
Thank you, Leslie. You're doing a fantastic job of having a comprehensive and my lens, a fair conversation. I was talking with one of my sisters earlier this morning. She's an attorney, and she was saying that she worked with the refugee office in Belize in the late 80s. The largest refugee community in Belize is in the Kaya district out west. It's called the Valley of Peace. And under Belize's first prime minister, and with the approval of the parliament, funding was sought from UN, what was it?
HCR,
UN, yeah, that's what, yeah, UNHCR.
Mhm.
And so Salvadoranians, I believe it was 50 families every year, I think they agreed to, would get an acre of land to live on and have 50 acres of land to work. They were given agricultural equipment. Many of the refugees were peasant farmers. For every 3 Salvadorian family, a Belizean family could live in the community. It's a thriving community 40-something plus years later. A number of them provide fruits and vegetables to the market in Belmopan. And we have first generation Salvadoranians who are born in Belize. A number of them are professionals. We were sharing before the show started that that has been your experience as well. And we'll go to break in about 4 minutes, but I wanted to know, and we'll expand on this more in the third segment and the final segment. Just what would you say are the root causes of the injustices that has been systemic in El Salvador? And when we come back after the break, you could share, how do you, after working so closely with community members, how do they see these concerns being solved?
Yeah, I think, that's a model. And unfortunately, El Salvador, as I mentioned, is a very small country, so they can't give an acre to every farm worker. But most Salvadorans are very honest, humble, and hardworking. And they are the ones that pay the price for these wars. And I think if there were policies from the United States and from the Salvadoran government to empower people, give them land, give them the training, that's a much better model than repression. You're not going to do away with poverty by locking up the poor or taking down their businesses and making them disappear from the city center or, places where tourists go. The government also, I forgot to mention, they burned down several businesses poor people had on the beach. So you can't do away with poverty or make it invisible by criminalizing the poor. Those policies are not sustainable. You need policies like the Belizean government implemented, giving people tools to survive. And I think it's, it needs to go beyond that, because there was, a land reform program in El Salvador to give land to the poor, because that was one of the root causes. The as I have been mentioning, the confiscation of the lands by the Spanish conqueror settlers, but it was like too little too late, and the land's no longer a source of wealth for Salvadorans because there is so little, and it is so densely populated. But there can be mechanisms to at least, still people do live off of growing corn and beans like they have for centuries, and giving them empowerment and tools to generate more income, and giving them a voice, because I think that's that's where Salvadorans have been left out. They've been being told what to do since that Spanish conquest, and they need to realize their own power. So it's more than just, obviously if they had the land they could give, that would make a huge difference, but giving them the land, but also giving them a voice, not taking away their voice, not manipulating the elections or manipulating social media, but actually listening and giving Salvadorans a voice and power.
Okay, we'll take the quick break now. I have another minute, but let me say that many Belizeans then and now push back on the state giving refugees land and in such large quantities because there's so many Belizeans who do not own land. And so there's two sides to that story. But we'll take a quick break,
Okay.
come back, and I want to stay tuned. Got a big conversation this morning.
Okay, thank you.
This plan, I can't left this plan. Smart Belize.
Hey there, smart thinkers! We're turbocharging your mobile experience with Smart's powered up postpaid plans. Imagine a world where your data speeds flows faster than ever. Well, guess what? We've cranked up the dial and unleashed the postpaid power of Smart's lightning fast LTE data on all our postpaid plans. That's right, no speed bumps, more data. It's like having a limitless highway of data speed at your fingertips. Whether you're a lone ranger with an individual plan or a squad rolling with a group plan, everyone gets to surf, stream, and share at enhanced, full, high-quality speed. Switch to Smart's powered-up postpaid plans today and ride the wave of postpaid power. Visit any Smart showroom or smart-bz.com for details and make your mobile experience smarter and faster. Smart, bringing people together.
I know I can't left this plan. I can't left this plan.
Make light work lighter and quicker with switch technology from Axi Power Tools. Axi Switch technology breaks the bondage of power cords and grants you the luxury of freedom and precision. Switch one battery across all your Axi line power tools effortlessly, allowing for quick and efficient work. Cut the cords. Choose efficiency with Axi Switch technology. Only at Benny's. Quality and savings.
Upcoming enhancements to My Social Security. The new healthcare provider feature seamlessly connects healthcare providers, insured persons, and employers to facilitate the payment of sickness benefits. Here are the enhancements. Registered healthcare providers will create and submit online medical certificates using their healthcare provider accounts. Insured persons will receive a link to view the medical certificate to complete and submit their sickness benefit claim. And employers will receive an email notification of their employee's sickness claim. Also, the insured person and their employer will receive a copy of the claim decision letter after review. Healthcare providers, insured persons, and employers are encouraged to create a portal account to access and benefit from these new services on My Social Security at ssbportal.org.bz. My Social Security online portal. Social Security at your fingertips.
We da fear. Nobody do it to no Guatemala. Follow me now. This a VTA. We da fear. Nobody do it to no Guatemala. This a me. My name is Pupa. Belize me come from the Belize City area. 110% Belize and proud of it. So don't tell me about maritime area. Long time ago dollar because patriots.
Welcome back to Sunday Review. It's the 12th edition, and you know what? Make I put on my glasses, make I say that we're week we in the 26th week for 2024. And I just did a 12th edition, but don't worry about nothing. Everything levels. We have Leslie Schuld. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. She's been living in El Salvador for over 3 decades, working in solidarity with people within communities. And I keep saying to people, and I was so appreciative when you mentioned it, Leslie, there's a difference between charity and solidarity. Charity is top down, and it's my surplus that I'm giving you out of the goodness of my heart. Solidarity is working within communities, respecting people as equals, regardless of their class status, and really working for the liberation of people to create a world that is different from this one that is very capitalist driven on the backs of oftentimes the working class people of color, as the gap widens between the wealthy predatory class and impoverished working class people. So Leslie, in this final segment, I was asking you to share more on when the 3 arms of the of government does not work, like it has not been working in El Salvador. How does that impact the lives of the majority of everyday people, 1? And 2, what solidarity actions can people who are listening do to be in solidarity with people for a better life?
Okay, well, I think, you know, it has a huge impact when there's not independence of judiciary, president, and executive and congressional powers. And we've seen that now. You know, prior, the Congress here in El Salvador was called the House of the People. Organizations, communities could bring their proposals about, you know, not privatizing water. We have a very important law that we're fear could be overturned about that prohibits metallic mining in El Salvador. And people could bring their proposals and organize, and the legislature would hear them and approve, debate, or approve or disapprove. Those doors have been closed. In fact, all the laws that were being developed over years, the official party has sent them all to the filing cabinet, to the archives, and will not discuss any of them. So, and there were very important laws around, you know, that were being discussed about, you know, water as a human right, about legislative identity to recognize the identity of LGBT community. So very, very important legislation that has been sent to the archives, and there's no now channel for organizations or communities to be heard in the Legislative Assembly to put forward their proposals for improving society. The other thing is, yeah, with the lack of independence in the judicial branch, people don't have a place to turn for justice. It's not a justice system, it's a system now on vengeance. There have been thousands of filings of habeas corpus for arbitrary detentions during the past 2 years. And of the thousands, way less than 100 have been resolved by the Supreme Court. So there's no where to turn to if your family member has been arbitrarily detained, only to nonprofits or human rights defender organizations. Nobody's allowed to have a trial. The adults that have been, these 80,000 plus people that have been arrested, no adult has had the right to a trial. They will not have a trial. The earliest, they've now extended the investigation period another 2 years, so the earliest trials will be in 2026. The government also passed a law that they can try up hundreds or even thousands of people at once, so that's no chance of due process, because they have no way now of dealing with the 80,000 people that have been arrested. And so not having these independent judiciary is having a huge impact on the innocent people. The innocent people are treated equally as the criminals, although the criminals, as I've mentioned, have get a little better treatment than the innocent people. So there's not so it's devastating. They don't get, there's not a voice to get into the Congress. There's not a voice to get into justice in the judicial system. And the only small piece, if you can get the president's ear through social media, some people have gotten justice through that. When some cases we've been able to expose, if they go viral on social media, we've gotten some people out of prison because of that. More so than the president listens more to social media than to his own judicial system. And even though he's appointed most of them. So it's very dangerous not having a system of checks and balances, and not, undermining the democratic system, because people don't have a place to turn to. They go to the NGOs or the media or the human rights defenders, which still have a voice in El Salvador, but we're very concerned now that opposition political parties have been pretty much annihilated. We're afraid that the only voice of the people or voice of criticism left, that we may be shut down as well. So it's, and I mentioned, it's President Bukele's of Palestinian descent, but he has been getting advice. He's met with the Israeli government, which we all know is carrying out genocide at this time. So very concerned about what patterns or what models he's using now to get control of the country. So the impact of people's lives, as I mentioned, over 80,000 people have been detained. A lot of them are hardworking and providers for the family. Their children are left orphaned. Hundreds of thousands of children are left orphaned. So what's the future? Will they want vengeance? Will they emigrate? Will they look, they don't have much future because now their poverty situation's gotten worse. Like, I have a goddaughter, I go to her house and she lives in the countryside, and there's a young 11-year-old girl there helping her cook and stuff. And I asked, who's this young woman? And she said, oh, she's the neighbor. Her mother's in jail, so she helps us out and we give her food. And I said, well, who does she live with? She lives with her grandmother. Well, now the grandmother passed away 2 months ago. So this little girl, she's now 13, is living on her own. And that's on the Holy Spirit Island, where the CIS has been working for 25 years. There's no gang structures, and yet 25 people have been arbitrarily arrested. I know one young mother, she has a 2-year-old son. She's had to go to work. Her husband was the provider. She's working in construction, and she doesn't have anybody to take care of the baby. So she's taking this 2-year-old baby, and he's filled with sand and cement. So the impact's immeasurable. I saw a little girl, her father's in prison. She writes every month. Her mother has to go, as I mentioned, to provide hygiene, food, medicine, clothing. The little girl sends a note to her father every month thinking that he gets that note. Well, no, there's no correspondence allowed. And she writes a note, dear Poppy, I love you. I miss you. You need to come home soon. And she believes that her father receives these notes. So it's heartbreaking. The psychological impact on the family, as well as the people that are detained, is immeasurable. The leader of this island, Marta Perez, she's been the CIS grassroots organizer on the island for 25 years. Her brother, who was the CIS boat driver to get the scholarship students to the mainland and protected them from the gangs, because in the mainland there are gangs, he is detained. He's 60. He's not in good health. She was the one, people were afraid to even talk to each other because they all say, well, my family member's innocent, but I don't know about yours, because there's a slogan saying, oh, if you haven't done any crime, you have nothing to fear. Well, that's hogwash, because the innocent are the people being arrested. And so anyway, Marta, because of the stress, she was the one that brought the families together. Her brother's still detained now over 2 years, and she, because of that stress, her diabetes got complicated, and she died this January. And because she felt like she was powerless. So it's the devastating impact is really immeasurable, and what this will mean for the future. The the Civil War killed 70,000 people. This war against the gangs, there's over 80,000 people now detained. And as I'm mentioning, many of them are innocent and victims of the gangs, as well as we don't mind the gang leaders that are locked up. That's not what we're protesting. We're protesting the majority of innocent people and people that are victims of the gangs that the government is calling gang collaborators, and torturing them and their families now for over 2 years. So the impact, what can people do? I think it's very important to come to El Salvador like people did during the war. During the war, the propaganda was it was just a war against the violent guerrillas, and there weren't civilians murdered. And so the same thing's happening now. So unless people come down and hear testimonies firsthand, people in El Salvador that I talk to, they say, I didn't realize it. I thought it was just gang members being arrested, and let alone outside the country. Until they have a family member arrested, they don't realize it. And even some people then say, oh, it was just an accident by the government, but they're really just arresting gang members, that they arrested my family member. Or, the government gave out a food basket. So yeah, they did arrest my son, but I've never had a government give me a food basket. People are very humble and naive in certain ways. And so it's really important to get people's testimonies out, and they've been blocked. People, when they get out of prison, some of them have told us they were made to sign a thing that they will not talk to the media or put anything on social media. The few people, there's been, the only people that have a right to a trial right now are minors that have been arrested, and we were able to get one minor absolved. He was, and there's been about 1,200 trials. Only 80 have been found innocent. And it's very hard because you're not allowed to bring any witnesses with you into the trial. Only the lawyer is allowed in. But in the case of minors, the family members allowed in. So that's how we know about, and this young man was convicted on the lies of a military sergeant. And the judge just took the word with no evidence. The military sergeant said this young man had been packing suitcases full of food to take the gangs in the mangroves when he was arrested, that he fled when he saw the military sergeant, but there's no pictures of this alleged bags of food. There's no bags of food. So just alone on the arresting military officer's testimony, he was convicted to 10 years in jail. And we did appeal the case, and it goes to another court. And luckily there was an honest judge that heard, and just by the own contradiction and lies, because you're not allowed to present any new evidence in the appeal, the young man was absolved. So he was one of the 80 that have been absolved, but we were only able to get that testimony because he was arrested with 6 other men on the island. And we had their testimonies from the beginning about how they were arrested in their homes, eating dinner or sleeping late one Sunday night. And the military sergeant in his testimony under oath said he arrested these 7 men packing bags of food for the gangs, and that they fled when they saw him. And this following morning, because of course you wouldn't be taking food in the mangroves at night. So he lied about the whole condition of the arrest. During his own testimony, he said he saw them, they were packing these bags of food on the basketball court. Then in his same testimony, he said they were packing them on the soccer field. They're 2 completely different places. So his own lies, we were able to unmask. And because we had the testimony of the islanders and nobody corroborated the testimony of the sergeant, we were able to get the young man absolved. He was absolved December 12th of last year. They didn't let him out of jail till February 12th of this year. And that's only after our organization got asked a influencer, a social media influencer. It's called the program's Crisis Letal from Spain. And they gave both sides, they did not come until the government invited them. But they also came out to the island and got the testimony of the family and the islanders and presented this. And 3 days after it went on social media, the young man got out. We never, I don't think they were going to let him out. In fact, he did not know he won his case. He didn't know he had a letter of freedom until the night we went to pick him up. And instead, he was told by the head of prison that he was going to the gang prison for life and that he would die and rot there, a 17-year-old man. And so that, that's another psychological torture and kidnapping, that he was held 2 months after he had a judge's order for immediate release. But that's, the impact is just immeasurable on the psychological torture on the family. So it's very important for people to come out, be in solidarity, to listen. Many people are afraid to speak. Like we have we have scholarship programs in many places in the country. 2 of our scholarship students, their mother was arrested. When she went to the police station to ask why her brother was arrested, they said, "We'll arrest you too," because there was a big, heavy pressure at the beginning to get quotas, because the president said he wanted 60,000 people arrested because that was the alleged number of gang members. So the police and military were getting bonuses for everybody arrested and days off. So the 2 young girls they're 3 young girls, they're orphaned. The one girl has epilepsy. She's had bad attacks because her mother's not there. And, I asked them if they would speak to a media, and they said, yes, they would, but they wanted their faces covered and their names not released because their classmates don't know that their mother's arrested, because people will assume then that their mother is a gang member, and they're, and of course, afraid of reprisals from the government. But it's much more than that, the stigmatization. So people are self-censored, and most people will not speak out and give testimonies, but they will if independent or international delegation, they feel safer. So I think it's important for people to come to El Salvador and hear these testimonies, to hear the other side of the coin, that it's not all, not all that glitters is gold, that not everything is just so secure as the propaganda puts out, and what are the impacts on people's lives. And I think, I know a lot of people don't like to do social media, but I think getting out the stories on social media, that's the one Achilles heel of the government here. They use social media to manipulate. They violate their own laws. They passed a law that you could not put any pictures or statements of gang members on the media. But then they put the innocent person's picture on social media and say he's a gang member. So they violate their own laws. They manipulate people's minds. So I think the only way to counter that is also for people to get on social media. And as I said, some people have been released because of social media campaigns and getting the truth out. You have to really dig, because people are afraid to speak. But once those stories get out, people start to become aware that there's another side of the coin, that there's a flip side, that it's not all, that everything's great now and everybody feels great, because, a lot of people are suffering. A lot of people are fearful. People are definitely afraid to speak out. The polls, the opinion polls, the same people that say they support the regime say they're afraid to share their opinion. They're not in agreement with the arrest of innocent people. So I think, the main way is for people to come out and listen and hear both sides of the story. We have a young man, he was killed, murdered by the gangs. It was a horror, a tragedy. He was killed. He was in his 5th year studying architecture from a poor family. He was murdered by the gangs. The family invites me, 9 years ago, the family invites me to the mass every year to commemorate this young man's life. And it's a very gang infested area of Mexicanos, where all the gangs are. You can't, you have to ask permission to cross to different neighborhoods. So at the mass, I was trying to see the bright side of this. I said, "Oh, is the neighborhood safer now?" And they laughed at me. They said, "It's a mediatic piece. No, we don't feel safer. We, we still feel that same fear, not from the gangs, but from the police and military. We know our next door neighbor, he was arrested arbitrarily. He's in jail. we don't feel safer. And these are from very dangerous areas. Other areas where we work, Distrito Italia, it's famous, dangerous areas. Some of our scholarship students will say, yeah, I feel safe now to go to the bus stop. I can go to the soccer field now. Other people, they're saying they're being extorted by the gang members' families, that they're being threatened, that they have to give their house over to a gang member's family, that they're getting orders from Mexico. And there's other gang members in hiding in the community, even though they're not visible on every corner, doesn't mean that they're not there. They're just reorganizing in different fashion. So I think it's really important to come and hear all sides of the story, and yes, applaud that neighborhoods are safer where they are and that people can travel freely. But that doesn't justify arresting innocents or police abuses, arbitrary arrests. One of our students, the police, because this is what was called the red neighborhoods. They get all the young people off the bus and search them. One of our young women, they have to take off their shirts, and the policeman ripped her bra off. I mean, and these aren't even the biggest horror stories, because she's free, she wasn't arrested. And that's the horror, when the family member's in jail and you don't know if they're alive or dead. There's no proof that they're alive. The government refuses to give any proof. And then they hear the horror stories of how the prisoners are treated. They don't know for sure. So I think, it's very important for delegations to come down to document, to get out these stories on social media, so people can also know that it's not the solution. We don't believe it's the solution, that it's a lasting solution. Repression, a war against the poor is not going to change the social and economic exclusion. You can't hide the poor just by arresting them and taking down their businesses. You have to have social programs that include them into society and give them opportunities for education, for jobs, and be respected. And be respected is very important. So I would encourage people
Leslie,
to come out.
What about the press in Salvador? Are journalists able to report freely?
They are, but they're threatened. They're attacked constantly. The independent journalist, El Faro, the most in-depth investigative newspaper, has moved their administration out of the country because the government can intervene in their take their bank accounts and their legal status at any time. So there are threats against the press. There have been, there was a community journalist that was arrested. That's one of the stories that went viral, and he was eventually let go. And then for giving his testimony, he was going to be arrested again. But again, the people responded on social media, so they didn't arrest him again. So, and the government, they have thousands of social media channels to make it look like, these thousands of different media outlets support them in different words. And they have their own TV. And when there's like an event, the government doesn't allow independent media and just their own media. So they are able to give a narrative, control a lot of the narrative. They have their own TV, radio, social media, newspaper that the taxpayers are paying for, that dominate. But there still is independent journalism in El Salvador. But that could be shut down, and they've gotten threats. Their accounts their telephones have been intervened through a program called Pegasus. So they are in danger of being shut down.
Before you give us your social media contact for your organization, please tell us the story about President Nayib Bukele tearing down historical tiles. Was in the palace?
Yeah, and the National Palace, which is protected by cultural patrimony laws. It's a historical palace. It's just used, tourists go there to tour. And the tiles on the floor were hydraulic tiles from Italy, handmade by artists. And for the presidential inauguration this past June 1st, a month before the president, in addition to tearing down a whole city block of businesses, of poor people that had paid taxes, paid for those posts, on a few days' notice were torn. They had to move out with all their inventory. It was ripped down, and a big fountain to make it look like Europe was put in place of people's, living, being able to sustain themselves. In addition, in the National Palace itself, where he had the inauguration and gave his speech in a suit styled after Simon Bolivar, the liberator of Latin America, to make himself look, present this image of a liberator. Image is everything for him. He tore out these artistic historic tiles that were protected by cultural patrimony laws and replaced them with white and gold tiles and spray painted the insides of the palace gold, similar to former U.S. president's style of gold, everything gold. And an artist in El Salvador, everybody was kind of shocked and, taken aback, but an artist who's also a doctor, a medical doctor, he went and asked when they were ripping up these tiles, can he have some, because they're historical and art, they're art. He was told no. He went to the dumpster, which was being surrounded by military, that he couldn't take it. And then they were moved to another dumpster in secret, where he actually got them some of the tiles. He took them to the United States to give to museums and talk to officials about, because these are international laws that protect cultural patrimony. When he got back to the country, he filed a lawsuit because the government violated his laws. They didn't want to take the denunciation. He insisted and had to pull out all the laws that protected these tiles and the art in the National Palace. And when he got back, he's a Salvadoran. He got back in the country. He was interrogated for 3 hours about what he was doing in the United States. He went to the hospital where he was worked. There were military waiting for him. They were calling family members. He was getting threats. Basically, he's now on his way to ask for political asylum in the United States because of the seriousness of these threats. So just, the government, the law applies to everybody except themselves. As you mentioned, President Bukele, there's 7 places in the articles in the Constitution that prohibit a president in 2 consecutive terms. They can run again, but not consecutively. It's a 5-year term. The Constitution was violated. They violate their own laws that apply just to the poor and not to themselves. And so the cultural patrimony, which are international laws, are also being violated. And in fact, then after this lawsuit was presented, just 2 or 3 days ago, the government fired 300 government cultural workers that support cultural patrimony laws, which cultural workers tend to do, and also that were pro inclusion of LGBT rights. He said now that he hired a new cultural minister who has no cultural background, just that to promote traditional family values. And traditional family values, here it means pedophiles is common, rampant misogyny, feminicides, machismo, and not a family based on love. And that, so setting back women's rights and LGBTQ rights, decades, if not centuries. So that's, the fallout from protecting the cultural patrimony is to fire then anybody who protects cultural patrimony. And also he added anybody that's for social inclusion. He spoke at some right-wing religious PAC in the United States where former President Trump was, and they asked him to, and there he announced he was going to take any teaching about gender or sexual and reproductive rights out of the schools, and which he did immediately. And now this new cultural minister is now in charge of promoting the old family values and discriminating against LGBT and cultural people that protect cultural history. So
At that time, Leslie, it's 12:03. Give us your socials. People definitely want to know how they could stay in contact with the work you and your organization does.
okay, well, our webpage is cis-elsalvador.org. We're on Facebook as CIS I think if you Google CIS El Salvador, but it's Centro de Intercambio y Solidaridad is our name in Spanish. But our social media is both in Spanish and English. You know, we're on Twitter. You can also, I have an account. Don't publish much, but CIS El Salvador. I also have a personal account, Leslie Schuld, on Facebook, where I publish many important articles that are coming out and what people in the communities, what's happening in the communities and what our organization does. So I think my name's up on the screen, Leslie Schuld, SCHULD. You can, follow me, but write a note because I don't necessarily accept friends that I don't know. So say you heard me on the Belize television. Yeah, and the CIS, you can follow all our social media, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and we have a web page. And Instagram. Yeah, so.
Thank you
See-
so much, Leslie. This will be a relationship that I will definitely nurture.
Thank you. I
and
appreciate all
really-
your knowledge and sensitivity and interest and fear about, because if I can just add an antidote, we've just had 2 weeks of storms. People are left homeless, people died, and Bukele went and built a bridge in Guatemala and no appearance here attending to the people affected. He wants to be president of Central America and probably Belize too. So be careful. It's not all that glitters is gold, but thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Big help. Let me say thanks to our team behind the scene, our security guard, Lloyd Lois, Master Chief Operator, JD McKenzie. JD, thank you for bearing with me. I'm impatient self sometimes for coming in early, setting up everything. Thank you, JD. Thank you, Larry G in Creme Radio. I know I'm 5 minutes over, but I appreciate it. Remember to go back and listen to this conversation on XTV Belize for YouTube and the same for Facebook. This show will be repeated at, I think that 5:30. Yes, and I still can't remember. 5:30 this evening on XTV. Until, again, thanks, Leslie. Sending positive vibrations for the people who are doing meaningful work. Make sure you make yourself a priority and take care of yourself, Leslie.
Oh, thank you.
And then we should be back here next Sunday. Until then, honor the people and save the people.
Thanks.